She wanted to dominate him in bed, yet found herself broken. HFY Sci-Fi Stories. The stars stretched across the black sky like endless jewels, shining cold and distant. Far from Earth, a human prisoner sat quietly in the dim cell of an alien battleship. His name was Daniel Hale, a soldier who had been captured during a battle on the outer colonies. The alien ship belonged to the Threx Dominion, a species known for their strength and their hunger to control others. Among them was Commander Sarika, a figure feared even by her own kind. She believed no species could resist the might of the Dominion, not even humans. When Daniel was first dragged into the ship, Sarika had studied him with curiosity. She saw him as nothing more than another subject to break, another voice to silence, under her command. The Threx had crushed countless civilizations, forcing them to obey, and she expected the same with this lone human. Yet from the very first encounter, Daniel's eyes held something different. They were steady, filled with quiet fire, as if no chain or cage could ever fully hold him. In the cell, Sarika came often, standing tall in her dark armor, her sharp voice cutting through the silence. She ordered him to kneel, to speak in submission, to accept her as his ruler. Daniel refused without shouting, without rage. He simply met her gaze and said, "I don't kneel." His voice was calm, not defiant like a child, but firm like a stone that time itself could not erode. This unsettled Sarika in ways she could not admit. Days turned into weeks, and every method she used to break him failed. She tried intimidation, showing him the power of her ship's weapons, the endless reach of her empire. Daniel listened but showed no fear. She tried offering rewards, promising him comfort if he obeyed. He refused again, not out of arrogance, but because he believed there was more strength in holding to one's dignity than gaining safety through surrender. In her private chambers, Sarika thought about him more than she wished. Why was this single human so difficult to control? She had bent the wills of many before him, leaders, generals, even proud warriors from other worlds. Yet Daniel, alone and powerless, resisted with nothing but his will. She told herself it was stubbornness, but in truth, it was something deeper, something she began to feel as a shadow in her mind. One night, when the ship drifted through silent space, Sarika entered his cell again. She expected him to be broken by isolation, but instead she found him sitting cross-legged, his eyes closed in calm thought. She asked him what gave him such strength. Daniel opened his eyes and answered, "Humans are not strong because of weapons or numbers. We are strong because we endure. You think you can break me, but all you will do is teach me to resist more." Her hand tightened on the hilt of her blade, but she did not strike him. Something in his words froze her. In her mind, power was always about force, about crushing the weak, but Daniel spoke of a strength that did not depend on chains or fear. It was something she could not easily understand, and that unsettled her, more than any battlefield defeat. As time went on, Sarika began to test him in different ways. She placed him among her soldiers, hoping they would mock him and drive him into despair. Instead, Daniel's quiet courage earned their respect. She gave him impossible tasks, thinking failure would humiliate him. But even in failure, he never lowered his head, and that became more powerful than success. Unknowingly, Sarika began to see cracks forming in her own belief system. She, who thought herself unshakable, found herself drawn into a battle of willpower against one human. She had set out to dominate him, to prove her control absolute. But the longer she tried, the more she felt something breaking. Not in him, but inside herself. The ship continued its journey across the stars, carrying both the commander and the prisoner toward an unknown future. Around them, the vast universe waited, full of dangers and possibilities. Daniel did not know what would come next, but he knew one thing with certainty. No matter what the Threx Dominion planned for him, he would not bow. His spirit, like the spirit of humanity, was built to rise even when the body was caged. Sarika walked away from his cell that night with a strange heaviness in her chest. She had thought she was the master, and he was the prisoner. But as she looked back, she realized something that disturbed her deeply. Perhaps it was she who was caught. in chains, and Daniel who was truly free. The corridors of the Threx battleship echoed with the sound of heavy boots as soldiers marched in formation. The Dominion ship was a fortress of steel, its walls glowing faintly with alien technology. To most prisoners, it was a place of fear and despair. But to Daniel Hale, it had become something else. It was a stage where the struggle between human will and alien control was being tested. Commander Sarika watched him more closely with each passing day. She had not expected one human to take so much of her attention, yet she found herself drawn back to him again and again. What she once considered a simple task of domination had turned into something far more complicated. The man refused to yield, and with every refusal she felt her certainty shaking. One morning, Sarika ordered Daniel to be taken to the training chamber. The room was vast, filled with weapons, moving platforms, and strange machines designed to test strength and endurance. She wanted to see him fail, to prove to herself that his humanity was nothing compared to the power of the Dominion. The guards threw him a blunt training blade, while Threx soldiers stood around in silence. Sarika stepped forward and gave a sharp command. "Fight!" Daniel held the blade awkwardly. He was no expert in alien weapons, and his body was still recovering from captivity. Yet when the first Threx warrior charged at him, Daniel moved with instinct. He dodged, rolled, and blocked, taking blows but refusing to fall. He fought not with grace, but with raw determination, his eyes never leaving his opponent. The soldiers expected him to collapse within moments, but he stood again and again, battered yet unbroken. When the session ended, Daniel was bleeding and exhausted, but still upright. He met Sarika's gaze, breathing heavily, and said in a steady voice, "Is this what you call strength? I've seen children on Earth show more spirit," the soldiers murmured among themselves. Even though he had lost the battle, his courage had left an impression. Sarika silenced them with a glare, but inside, she was troubled. Why did his words strike deeper than any blade? Why did she feel that he had won, even in defeat? Later, in her private chamber, Sarika studied the reports of human history. Curiosity drove her to learn more about this species that resisted so fiercely. She read about wars fought on Earth, about humans rising after disasters, about their explorers reaching beyond their own world despite fragile bodies. The more she read, the more she began to understand. Humans did not need to dominate to be strong. Their strength came from survival, from unity, from a belief that tomorrow could always be better than today. Meanwhile, Daniel sat quietly in his cell, nursing his wounds. He did not know why Sarika tested him, but he knew she was watching. He understood something that she had yet to realize. This was no longer just about him as a prisoner. This was about humanity itself, about proving that no empire, no matter how vast, could crush the human spirit. The next day, Sarika visited him again. She stood at the door of his cell, her face hard and unreadable. "Why do you resist when you know you cannot win?" she asked. Daniel looked up at her, his expression calm. "Because winning is not the same as surviving. You think I fight to defeat you. I don't. I fight because giving up is worse than death. That is what you will never understand." Her chest tightened at his words. She turned away quickly, unwilling to let him see her doubt. Yet the doubt was there, growing like a seed in the darkness. For the first time in her career, she wondered if the Dominion's way was truly the strongest path. Over the following weeks, Sarika continued to test him. She placed him in different trials, mental puzzles, endurance challenges, and even situations where he could have betrayed his dignity to save himself. Every time, Daniel chose the harder road, the one that demanded sacrifice. It frustrated her, but it also fascinated her. Her officers began to notice her distraction. They whispered among themselves, questioning why their commander wasted so much time on one human. But Sarika silenced them with a single glance. None dared to question her directly, yet even she knew the truth. Daniel was becoming more than a prisoner. He was becoming a mirror, showing her parts of herself she had buried long ago. On the 30th day of his captivity, Daniel was led out onto the viewing deck. Through the great windows he saw stars burning like diamonds across the black sea of space. For the first time since his capture, he felt something close to peace. The universe was vast, yet here he was, a single man standing against an empire. The thought made him smile faintly. Sarika stood beside him, silent for a long moment. At last she spoke. "You should fear me, human. Yet you do not. Why?" Daniel turned his head slightly, his eyes reflecting the stars. "Because fear belongs to those who believe they are already beaten. I don't believe that. Not for me, not for my people." The silence between them deepened, heavy with unspoken truths. Sarika's hand trembled slightly at her side, though she quickly hid it. She had set out to break this man, to dominate his spirit. But with every passing day she felt it was she who was being broken, not by chains or force, but by the quiet, unshakable strength of humanity. The battleship drifted onward through the endless night, carrying with it a war of wills, greater than any clash of armies. And though no one else could see it, something had begun to change inside Commander Sarika. The days aboard the Threx battleship grew longer, yet Daniel's spirit remained the same. What had started as a simple act of resistance had grown into something larger. Even the guards who once mocked him began to notice. They no longer looked at him as a weak prisoner, but as someone who carried an invisible weight with unshakable strength. Commander Sarika, however, was the one most deeply affected. She found herself standing outside his cell more often, lingering in silence before entering. She told herself it was strategy, a way to understand the human mind, but in truth she was drawn to him. Every word he spoke, every time he refused to yield, left her with questions she had never dared to ask herself. One evening, she called for Daniel to be brought into the central chamber. It was a room built for judgment, where prisoners were often forced to swear loyalty to the Dominion. The chamber was filled with Threx officers, their sharp eyes watching from the shadows. Sarika stood tall on the platform, her voice echoing. "This human has resisted for weeks. He has refused to bend, refused to kneel. Today I give him his final chance. He will kneel before the Dominion, or he will face the cost of defiance." The officers nodded in approval, eager to see their commander crush the human's will once and for all. Daniel, however, stood calmly in the center, his shoulders squared, his expression firm. His body carried bruises and scars from trials, but his spirit seemed untouched. He looked at Sarika and spoke in a steady voice that carried through the chamber. "You ask me to kneel, but you do not understand what you are asking. For a human, kneeling is not just lowering the body, it is lowering the heart. That I will never do." A murmur ran through the room. The officers expected fear, but instead they saw a prisoner who spoke as though he were the one in command. Some frowned, others whispered, but all felt the weight of his words. Sarika's jaw tightened. She wanted to strike him down, to show her people that the Dominion's rule was absolute, yet her hand did not move. Something in his voice caught her again, the same unyielding spirit that had haunted her thoughts since the first day. "You are a fool," she said coldly, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "Strength is survival. The weak serve the strong. This is the law of the universe." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No. Strength is not about crushing others. True strength is lifting yourself after every fall and helping others rise with you. That is what humans believe. That is why we cannot be broken." His words echoed against the chamber walls, and for the first time, silence fell over the officers. They were warriors of the Dominion, raised to believe in power through dominance, yet this single man spoke with a conviction that made their own creed feel hollow. Sarika dismissed the assembly soon after, claiming she would deal with the prisoner later. But when she returned to her quarters, she could not rest. She walked back and forth, her mind filled with his words. She remembered her own youth, the endless training, the lessons hammered into her about conquest and rule. She had never questioned it, never allowed herself to doubt. Yet now doubt was everywhere, crawling into every thought. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his cell, unaware of the turmoil he had stirred. He was tired, his body sore, but his mind remained sharp. He thought of Earth, of the people he had left behind, and of the simple things he missed, the sound of rain, the smell of trees, the laughter of children. Those memories gave him strength. He was not resisting only for himself, but for all the humans who might face the Dominion in the future. The next day, Sarika ordered him to accompany her to the observation deck again. They stood side by side, the stars stretching endlessly before them. She studied him in silence, trying to understand what made this fragile being so unshakable. Finally, she asked a question that had been growing inside her. Human, what if resistance brings only pain? What if survival requires surrender? Daniel looked at her with calm eyes. Then the pain is worth it. Because surrender takes more than freedom. It takes away who we are. And if we lose that, survival means nothing. Sarika turned away, hiding the storm in her heart. She wanted to dismiss his words, to call them foolish. Yet she could not. She had seen warriors surrender with ease, had seen empires collapse after defeat. But this human refused even when he had nothing left. It was a strength she had never witnessed before, and it shook the foundation of everything she believed. As the battleship continued its journey, whispers spread among the crew. The human prisoner had become a symbol, though no one said it aloud. Some admired him, others feared the effect he had on their commander. But all knew something was changing. That night, Sarika stood alone before the great window of her chamber. She stared at the endless galaxy, her reflection shining faintly on the glass. For years, she had believed herself unbreakable, the perfect servant of the Dominion. Yet now she felt a fracture inside, a crack widening with every word from the human. She clenched her fists, whispering to herself, "He should be broken by now. Why is it I who feels broken?" The battleship drifted through the void, its engines humming like the heartbeat of a giant creature. Inside, tension grew like a hidden storm. The human prisoner was no longer seen as just another captive. He had become something more, though. None of the Threx dared to admit it openly. Daniel Hale remained steady, his spirit untamed. Weeks of confinement had tested him, but he carried himself with the same quiet determination that unsettled his captors. To him, every day was not a loss, but another chance to prove that humanity could not be bent. Commander Sarika felt the weight of his presence the most. Once, she had believed domination was simple. Force was applied, and the weak submitted. But Daniel was like a stone that refused to crack no matter how many times it was struck. Instead of breaking, he reflected strength back at her, and the more she tried to understand him, the more she felt her own certainty slipping away. One evening, a message arrived from the Dominion High Council. Sarika gathered her officers in the command chamber. The council demanded an update on the human prisoner. They had heard of his resistance, and some were not pleased. "Break him or dispose of him," the message read, its tone sharp and commanding. The officers looked at Sarika, waiting for her response. For a long moment she said nothing. The logical choice was simple: obey the council, end the human, and silence the whispers that spread among the crew. Yet when she thought of Daniel standing proud in the judgment hall, speaking words that rang like steel, she hesitated. Finally, she dismissed her officers and remained alone in the chamber. Her thoughts were heavy. Was her hesitation weakness? Or was it something else, something she had never known before? That night, Sarika visited Daniel's cell again. The dim light cast long shadows across the walls as she stepped closer. He looked up at her, his calm eyes steady even in the darkness. "They want me to end you," she said flatly. Daniel did not flinch. "Then why haven't you?" The question pierced her more than she expected. She could have answered with pride, with a threat, but instead she found herself silent. His eyes searched hers, not with fear, but with curiosity. As if he already knew the answer, she refused to speak. "You don't want to break me," Daniel said softly. "You want to understand me." Sarika's chest tightened. She turned sharply and left without another word, but his voice lingered in her mind long after. The following days brought new trials. The ship entered a region of space patrolled by rebels, small groups of species who resisted Dominion control. They were weak compared to the vast empire, yet bold enough to strike supply lines and ambush isolated ships. Sarika's crew prepared for possible conflict, unaware that the rebels had already marked their ship. Daniel sensed the tension in the air. Guards moved with sharper steps. Officers barked orders with urgency. From his cell, he could hear the faint alarms of long-range scanners. Something was coming. It happened 2 nights later. The ship was ambushed near an asteroid field. Explosions shook the hull as rebel vessels swarmed, firing weapons that sparked against the Dominion's shields. The crew scrambled to respond, and for the first time, Daniel felt the ship tremble under real danger. Sarika led her forces with precision, her voice calm even as the ship rocked under fire. But the rebels were cunning. They disabled several systems, and for a moment the mighty Dominion battleship seemed vulnerable. In the chaos, Daniel's cell door malfunctioned, opening with a hiss of broken machinery. He stepped into the corridor, free for the first time since his capture. He could have run. He could have searched for a shuttle and tried to escape. But instead he turned toward the sounds of battle. He knew that if the ship fell, he would die with everyone else aboard. And though the Dominion was his enemy, survival meant more than vengeance. Humanity's strength was not only in resistance, but in choosing when to fight alongside others. Daniel reached the engine deck, where smoke filled the air and alarms screamed. Engineers struggled to stabilize the failing power core. Without hesitation, he jumped in to help, pulling cables, sealing breaches, his voice steady as he directed panicked soldiers. Many stared in shock. This human, their prisoner, working to save the very ship that held him captive. Word of his actions reached Sarika. She turned sharply, disbelief in her eyes. Yet when she arrived at the engine deck, she found him covered. In grime, his hands burned, but the systems slowly stabilizing. He met her gaze and said simply, "If this ship falls, we all fall. I don't choose death when life can still be fought for." For a long moment, Sarika said nothing. Around them, Threk soldiers looked at Daniel with something close to respect. The human who had refused to kneel was now the one who kept them standing. The rebels were eventually driven back, their ships retreating into the shadows of the asteroid field. The battleship survived, scarred but intact. In the aftermath, silence filled the decks. Everyone knew the truth. Without the humans' aid, they might have lost. That night, Sarika stood again at the observation deck. Daniel was brought there, no longer in chains but walking freely beside her. The stars burned brightly beyond the glass, silent witnesses to what had changed. "You could have escaped," she said quietly. "Why didn't you?" Daniel looked at her with steady eyes. "Because running isn't always freedom. Sometimes freedom is choosing what you stand for, even if it means helping those who once caged you." Sarika turned away, her heart unsettled. She had tried to dominate him, to shatter his spirit. Yet here he was, stronger than ever, and she felt herself breaking instead. The battle with the rebels left the Threk's battleship scarred but not destroyed. Repairs began quickly, soldiers moved with unusual energy, and for the first time, whispers of respect toward a human prisoner spread openly among the crew. Daniel. Hale had become more than just a captive. He had become a strange symbol, a reminder that strength was not only about weapons or domination. Commander Sarika felt the change most deeply. She had always believed fear held an empire together. Yet, now she saw her crew glance at Daniel with something she could not name, trust perhaps, or even admiration. It unsettled her. A single human without power or rank had done what years of Dominion rule could not: inspire her warriors in the middle of chaos. The High Council, however, would not see things this way. Reports of the battle would reach them soon, and Sarika knew they would demand answers. To them, Daniel was still only a prisoner, a tool to be broken or discarded. If they learned he had walked freely among her crew, saving their ship, they might view her as weak. Late at night, Sarika sat in her quarters staring at the cold light of the stars. She remembered Daniel's words. Freedom is choosing what you stand for. The thought gnawed at her, refusing to leave. She had stood all her life for the Dominion, for conquest and control. But was that truly strength? Or had she mistaken fear for power? Daniel, meanwhile, was returned to his cell, though the guards no longer locked the door as tightly as before. They looked at him differently now, almost as if he were one of them. He noticed, but he said nothing. He knew the smallest crack could, one day, become a fracture. The next morning, Scifi called Daniel to the command chamber. When he entered, the officers looked uneasy. A prisoner had never walked so calmly into the heart of the ship. Scifi stood tall before the council screen, where soon the High Council would appear. "I want you here," she told him. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because I want them to see what I see," she answered quietly. Moments later, the screen came alive with the sharp faces of the Dominion High Council. Their voices were cold, their eyes full of suspicion. "Commander Scifi," one of them said, "we received troubling reports. Your prisoner has been allowed freedom during combat. Explain." Scifi's jaw tightened, but before she could answer, Daniel stepped forward. He spoke with calm strength. "I saved this ship because survival matters. Not for the Dominion, not for conquest, but because life itself is worth protecting. You see me as weak because I will not kneel. But I tell you now, kneeling is weakness, standing even in chains is strength." The council members erupted in anger. "Silence, human," one of them shouted. "Your words are meaningless." But Scifi did not silence him. Instead, she turned to the council and said, "His words carry more meaning than conquest. He has shown my crew something that fear never could. He has shown them spirit." The chamber grew still. The council's eyes narrowed. "You are allowing this infection to spread through your ranks," they hissed. "Dispose of the human at once or face the consequences." The screen went dark, leaving only the silence of the command chamber. Officers shifted uneasily. Scifi looked at Daniel, her face unreadable. She had a choice to make: obey the council, or follow the strange truth she had begun to see. That night she went to his cell once more. Daniel stood waiting, as if he already knew she would come. "They want you dead," she said. "I know," he replied calmly. Scifi's voice lowered. "If I refuse, they may strip me of command. They may even end me." Daniel studied her carefully. "Then the choice is yours. But know this. Empires fall when they fear the truth. You are stronger than you think, Scifi. Not because of your rank, but because you can choose." For the first time, she let the mask of command slip. Her eyes softened, and for a moment she looked less like a conqueror and more like someone lost in the storm of her own doubts. Days passed, and the ship neared Dominion space. The crew felt the weight of the coming judgment. Some whispered that the human would not live to see another sunrise. Others secretly hoped their commander would defy the council. Daniel did not fear what was to come. He spent his hours quietly, sometimes speaking with guards, sometimes alone with his thoughts. He knew he could not predict the future, but he understood one truth clearly. His defiance had already planted a seed. Whether he lived or died, that seed would grow. Scifi, however, felt torn in ways she had never imagined. Loyalty to the Dominion had been her life's purpose, but now, loyalty to truth pulled her in another direction. Every time she looked at Daniel, she saw not a prisoner, but a mirror reflecting her own choices back at her. On the final night before their arrival at Dominion space, she called him once more to the observation deck. The stars stretched endlessly before them, silent and eternal. "Human," she said softly, "why do you not fear death?" Daniel turned his gaze from the stars to her. "Because death comes to everyone. What matters is how we live before it. I live standing." Scifi's heart stirred with emotions she could not name. For the first time in her life, she felt the chains of her own empire pressing against her soul. And she wondered, perhaps Daniel had been free all along, and she had been the prisoner. The battleship moved closer to Dominion space, its hull patched from the rebel attack. its crew restless with unspoken questions. For the Threx, loyalty to the Dominion was law, yet many now carried a quiet doubt they dared not share aloud. And, at the center of that doubt stood Daniel Hale, the human who refused to kneel. Commander Sarika felt the tension most. She had lived her life under the Dominion's shadow, its laws shaping every step, its will guiding every thought. But now, a single prisoner had shown her another path, one where strength came not from fear, but from choice. The council demanded Daniel's death, yet her heart hesitated each time she thought of obeying. On the morning of their arrival, she summoned Daniel to the command deck. Officers stared as he walked freely across the room, his chains no longer clasped. Whispers moved among them, some in disbelief, others in secret respect. Sarika stood before the great viewing window, the light of a distant sun glowing across her armor. She spoke without turning to him. When we reach Dominion Prime, they will expect your execution. If I refuse, I may lose everything. Tell me, human, why should I risk my life for yours? Daniel stood calmly beside her. His face was tired, marked by the trials of captivity, but his eyes burned with the same steady fire. You should not risk your life for me, he said simply. You should risk it for yourself, for what you already know is true. You feel it, Sarika. That is why you hesitate. Her jaw tightened. Truth is dangerous. Then it's worth more than anything, Daniel replied. The words struck her like a blade. She wanted to dismiss them, but they clung to her heart, impossible to ignore. For years she had told herself domination was strength, but now she wondered, had she only been hiding her fear behind the mask of power? Hours later, the battleship descended into Dominion Prime's orbit. The capital planet shone below, a vast world of towering spires and endless cities, the heart of the Empire's power. The High Council awaited her report in the Grand Chamber of Judgment. Daniel was brought with her, escorted by soldiers who looked uneasy. For the first time, he walked into the Dominion's core, the very place where decisions shape the fate of entire worlds. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with silver and steel, its ceiling glowing with pale light. The High Council sat high, upon their thrones, their sharp eyes fixed on Sarika as she entered. You have brought the human, one of them said, their voice echoing coldly. Now, Commander, fulfill your duty. End him here before us all and prove your loyalty. The order rang like iron. Soldiers shifted, ready to enforce it. Daniel stood silent, his eyes calm, waiting not with fear, but with certainty. Sarika's hand went to the hilt of her blade. The moment stretched long, the chamber holding its breath. She could obey, strike the human down, and remain a commander of the Dominion. Or she could choose another path, a path that terrified her more than death itself. Daniel's voice broke the silence. This is not about me, Sarika. It never was. It's about you. Who do you serve? Fear or truth? Her hand trembled. For the first time in her career, she felt the chains of the Dominion not on her body, but around her soul, and she realized Daniel was right. She was the one in captivity, bound by the Empire's lies. Sarika dropped her blade. The sound rang across the chamber like thunder. Gasps erupted from the soldiers. The High Council leaned forward, fury flashing in their eyes. I will not kill him, Sarika declared, her voice strong. He has shown me what true strength is. It is not in conquest. It is not in chains. It is in the spirit that refuses to kneel. And I will not kneel either, not to fear, not to lies. The chamber erupted into chaos. Guards rushed forward, but Sarika drew her weapon, not against Daniel, but against her own soldiers. For a moment, the entire hall froze, stunned by her defiance. Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady and firm. You see her as a traitor, but she has done something greater than any empire. She has chosen. That is the power you fear most. Not my resistance, not her blade, but choice. The High Council shouted commands, their voices sharp with anger. Yet the soldiers hesitated. Many of them had fought beside Sarika. had seen Daniel's courage with their own eyes. The seed of doubt, planted long ago, now grew in their hearts. Sarika glanced at Daniel. "This is only the beginning," she whispered. Together, they stood, in the center of the Dominion's heart, defiance shining brighter than the steel around them. For the first time in her life, Sarika felt free. Not because she commanded, but because she chose. The chamber shook with the sound of soldiers drawing weapons, the future uncertain, the path ahead filled with danger. But Daniel's words lingered, in the air, unshakable as stone. Freedom is choosing what you stand for. And in that moment, Sarika knew the battle was no longer about one human prisoner. It was about the future of the Dominion itself. The chamber of the High Council burned with fury. The thrones of the rulers towered above, their voices like cold fire as they shouted orders. Guards raised their weapons, their armor gleaming in the pale light. Commander Sarika stood at the center, blade in hand, her stance firm. Beside her, Daniel Hale remained calm, his eyes steady as the storm of the Dominion closed in around them. For a moment, the air was heavy with silence, like the calm before lightning splits the sky. Everyone waited for someone to move first. The council demanded obedience. The soldiers awaited orders. Sarika's crew watched with doubt in their eyes. And Daniel stood, a single human among giants, refusing to bow. "You will pay for this betrayal," hissed one of the counselors. "You were given power, Sarika, and you throw it away for a prisoner." "I throw nothing away," Sarika answered, her voice carrying through the hall. "I choose. That is something your empire has never understood." The guards advanced, their weapons sparking with energy. Sarika raised her blade. Yet before the clash began, Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between her and the soldiers. His voice rose, strong and clear, cutting through the tension. "Look at her," he said to the guards. "Your commander chooses truth over fear. And you? Will you kill her because you are told, or will you choose for yourselves? That is the power they fear the most, that you can decide." The soldiers hesitated. Some lowered their weapons slightly, uncertainty flashing across their faces. They had lived their entire lives obeying orders without question. But Daniel's words struck at something buried deep inside them. One soldier broke the silence. He stepped back, his weapon lowering. Another followed. Soon, a ripple moved through the ranks. Not all, but many hesitated, torn between loyalty to the council and the strange fire of freedom that now burned before them. The council erupted in rage. "Traitors, all of you, end them now!" The command broke the fragile pause. A storm of movement filled the chamber. Some soldiers advanced, but others stood still, refusing to fight. Sarika moved like lightning, defending against the first strike, her blade clashing with steel. Daniel ducked and rolled, using instinct more than skill, grabbing a fallen staff to block a blow. The battle was chaos. Sparks lit the hall, the sound of steel and energy blasts echoing like thunder. Yet even as the Dominion unleashed its wrath, something deeper shifted. Soldiers fought not just against Sarika and Daniel, but against their own chains. At the center of it all, Daniel fought with no thought of victory. He was only one man, fragile compared to the towering threats. But every time he fell, he rose again. Every strike against him was met with defiance. His refusal to stay down became louder than any weapon. Sarika fought at his side, her movements sharp and sure. For the first time, she was not fighting for conquest, not for the Dominion, but for something greater. She felt alive in a way she had never known. Every strike of her blade echoing the choice she had finally made. As the battle raged, more soldiers stepped back, unwilling to kill their own doubts. Some even turned against the council's guards, the seed of rebellion blooming in the heart of the empire. At last, the counselors themselves stood, their voices shrieking with fury. "You will drown in blood for this treachery," Daniel raised, his voice over the chaos. "No empire lasts forever, not when it builds itself on chains. Humanity has taught me one truth: freedom cannot be destroyed. It only waits in silence until it rises. His words carried across the chamber, reaching not only ears but hearts. The fighting slowed. The counselors, seeing the hesitation, retreated toward their private exits, their power shaken by what they could not control, choice. When the hall finally grew still, Sarika stood breathing hard, her armor marked with scars. Daniel leaned against his staff, his body bruised but unbroken. Around them, the soldiers lowered their weapons. Silence filled the chamber once more, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of change. Sarika turned to her crew, her voice steady. "You are free to choose. Stay with the Dominion or walk another path. But from this day, I will not command through fear. I will lead through truth." The soldiers exchanged glances. Many nodded, some still uncertain, but the first step had been taken. The Dominion's grip had been fractured in its very heart. Daniel looked at Sarika, his tired smile faint but real. "You see now, they can break bodies, but never the will. That is what it means to be human." Sarika held his gaze. "And now I know it means to be more than Dominion." Together they stepped out of the chamber, the stars of Dominion Prime shining beyond the spires. The future ahead was uncertain, full of danger but also full of possibility. The Empire would not fall in one night, but its chains had begun to crack. For Daniel, survival had never been about escape. It had been about standing. And for Sarika, freedom had never been about command. It had been about choice. In the silence of the galaxy, one truth echoed louder than any empire. Humanity could not be broken, and those who tried to shatter it often found themselves the ones left in pieces.